The autumn sunshine streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Bellini's, Manhattan's most exclusive Italian restaurant, as I watched Gerald nervously adjust his Rolex for the third time in 10 minutes. I couldn't help but smile behind my menu as he checked his phone again, no doubt expecting a message from Zelda, his yoga instructor whose downward dog had apparently led him straight into an upward affair. If only he knew that while he'd been planning his new life with her, I'd spent the last 2 months methodically examining every line of his family's Mitchell trust, the same trust that, due to his father's surprising foresight and my law degree, he never took seriously, listed me as the sole trustee with complete discretionary control. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sommelier approached with a bottle of Sassicaia 2015, Gerald's favorite way to display wealth without actually understanding wine. A special celebration, he announced with forced enthusiasm, his Tom Ford suit failing to mask the slight tremor in his hands. Little did he know how special this evening would truly become. To new chapters, I said, raising my glass with a steadiness that came from absolute certainty. The diamond on my finger caught the light, a 3-carat cushion cut that his grandmother had insisted he give me, though he'd always let everyone believe it was purchased with the profits from his successful investment strategy rather than the quarterly distributions I'd approved from the family trust. Gerald smiled that practiced smile that had once made my heart race at the Stevenson Foundation Gala 5 years ago, when he'd wooed me with stories of his financial acumen and philanthropic ambitions. What I hadn't realized then was that his greatest talent wasn't in growing wealth, but in spending it, particularly the wealth that had been accumulated over 3 generations by his family and protected through the very legal structures I now controlled. I took a measured sip of the wine, savoring not just its notes of black currant and cedar, but the moment itself, the precipice between his imagined future and the reality I was about to unveil. It had been a Tuesday afternoon when my friend Jane, a partner at Morris & Webb Accounting, had called me into her office with an uncharacteristically serious expression. "Abby, there's something you need to see," she'd said, sliding a folder across her immaculate desk. Inside were photos of Gerald and Zelda touring luxury apartments in the West Village, along with lease application paperwork dated for next month. The same month, Gerald had told me he needed to be in London for critical meetings with European investors. The joint bank account application was what truly made me laugh. He'd listed himself as the primary beneficiary of several Mitchell family properties and investments, all assets that were, in reality, controlled through the family trust that his father had insistently placed under my legal stewardship despite Gerald's repeated attempts to consolidate control. As I sat in Bellini's watching Gerald's carefully maintained facade, I thought about all the nights I'd spent reviewing trust documents with Anthony Hayes, the Mitchell family's longtime financial advisor. Charles Mitchell was wise to structure things this way, Anthony had said, helping me quietly document every instance where Gerald had misrepresented trust assets as his own personal holdings. The paper trail was immaculate, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. "How's the Brooklyn Heights project coming along?" I asked innocently, knowing full well that the property wasn't just a business venture, but the location where he'd been meeting Zelda for their early morning private sessions that had nothing to do with chakra alignment. The contractor I'd hired had maintained detailed records of every visit, every smoothie delivery, every extended meditation practice that ran suspiciously long. "Everything's on track," Gerald replied smoothly, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He'd always been proud of his ability to bluff in business meetings, had built his personal brand on being the unflappable deal-maker. But I'd learned to see the subtle tells, the same way I'd learned to read between the lines of bank statements, property deeds, and investment portfolios that constituted the Mitchell family legacy. Kevin Bradshaw, Gerald's business partner, had unexpectedly become an ally in my investigation. He'd arrived at my office one rainy morning with uncharacteristic nervousness clouding his usually confident demeanor. "I can't be part of this anymore," he'd said, laying out evidence of how Gerald had been manipulating company records to finance his new life with Zelda. The loyalty of business partners, it seemed, had its limits, especially when the Mitchell Trust owned a controlling interest in their venture. My fingers traced the stem of my crystal wine glass as I prepared for what would come next. In less than 24 hours, Gerald would discover that every property he'd been using as collateral for his new ventures had been quietly transferred to direct oversight by the Trust's Independent Management Committee. His access to the investment portfolio would be severed, and the carefully constructed house of cards he'd built would come crashing down with spectacular precision. "You seem distracted? Tonight," I observed, watching him try to maintain his usual charismatic smile. If he only knew that at this very moment, Jane was meeting with the bank's trust department, presenting irrefutable evidence of misrepresentation of fiduciary relationships. By tomorrow morning, Gerald Mitchell would be not just a cheating husband, but a man without access to the fortune he'd always taken for granted. The atmosphere in Bellini's shifted as other diners began arriving for the evening service. I watched the maitre d' escort a young couple to their table, their faces glowing with genuine affection, so different from the calculated performance Gerald maintained across from me. The warm, ambient lighting and richly appointed interior that had once felt romantic now seemed to cast long shadows, much like the secrets between us. Gerald adjusted his custom monogrammed cufflinks, a 5th anniversary gift I'd given him just months before discovering an emerald bracelet purchased for Zelda on our joint credit card. He studied the menu with feigned interest, unaware that his world was hours away from implosion. The waiter approached again, and Gerald ordered the Wagyu ribeye with his usual authority. I chose the Chilean sea bass, remembering how he'd once mentioned it was Zelda's favorite during a dinner I'd been too busy preparing trust documentation to attend. The gentle clink of silverware and murmured conversations around us provided the perfect backdrop for what was about to unfold. Anthony Hayes had called earlier today with final confirmation. Every document was in place, every signature verified, every transaction tracked. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, considering the substantial withdrawal Gerald had attempted to make yesterday from the Trust's discretionary fund, a withdrawal I had personally declined while he was in his strategy session with Zelda at the Brooklyn Heights property. "The West Hampton portfolio is looking promising," Gerald mentioned casually, reaching for his phone again. I knew he wasn't checking updates about any investment portfolio. The yoga studio where Zelda taught had confirmed his private mindfulness consultation was scheduled for tomorrow morning at the Brooklyn Heights property. "Speaking of promising ventures," I replied, maintaining eye contact as I reached for my clutch. "I had an interesting meeting with Kevin today." The slight tightening of his jaw told me everything I needed to know. Kevin had always been the more cautious of the two, maintaining detailed records of every transaction, every agreement, every deviation from their official business plans. His conscience had finally gotten the better of him after learning about the apartment Gerald had secured for Zelda using company funds. Funds that ultimately traced back to the Mitchell family trust. A well-dressed woman at the bar caught my attention. Her elegant posture reminded me of Gerald's mother's warning years ago. "Men like my son," she'd said during a rare moment of candor at their Southampton estate. "They don't build fortunes. They inherit them." I dismissed her words. Then, blinded by Gerald's charisma and apparent business acumen, now I understood she'd seen what I hadn't. The careful way he'd positioned himself within Manhattan's elite circles, always leveraging connections, always climbing higher on the foundation his grandfather had built. The sommelier approached with another bottle of wine Gerald had ordered earlier. I watched him taste it with the sophistication he'd cultivated over years of charity galas and board meetings. Each gesture was perfectly calculated, just like his plans for the new life he thought awaited him. What he didn't know was that Jane had already spoken with the leasing office at the West Village property, armed with proof of fraudulent financial declarations he'd made to secure the luxury apartment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Mitchell Foundation board meeting went well today, I mentioned, noting how his attention suddenly sharpened. He'd been trying to gain a voting position on that board for months, unaware that his father's colleagues had long seen through his carefully constructed veneer. They're particularly interested in the allocation of recent investment funds. Gerald's hand paused halfway to his wine glass, a momentary break in his usually smooth movements. The look in his eyes shifted from confidence to something else. The first flicker of uncertainty I'd seen since discovering the apartment lease applications. He recovered quickly, but not before I caught the slight tremor in his fingers as he reached for his water instead. The gentle symphony of dinner service continued around us, but the air between us had grown thick with unspoken tensions. A couple at the next table celebrated what appeared to be an anniversary, their genuine joy a stark contrast to our choreographed performance. Gerald glanced at them briefly, and I wondered if he felt any remorse about planning his exit while pretending to maintain our marriage. My phone buzzed quietly, a message from Jane confirming that the final documents had been filed with the Trust Administration office. Tomorrow morning, when Gerald arrived for his mindfulness session with Zelda, he would instead find himself facing a very different kind of meeting. The thought brought a slight smile to my face, one that Gerald misinterpreted as appreciation for the expensive wine he'd ordered. The Brooklyn project has really turned a corner, he continued, unaware that I knew exactly what, or rather who, had been occupying his time there. The property that he'd claimed would be his masterpiece would instead become the stage for his greatest downfall. Every private meeting, every early morning yoga session, every extended lunch had been meticulously documented, creating a pattern that even his most loyal supporters couldn't ignore. As our main courses arrived, I watched him cut into his Wagyu ribeye with the precision he applied to everything in his life. Control. That's what Gerald had always craved. Control over his image, his business ventures, his relationships. But he had made one critical mistake, underestimating the woman who had quietly enabled his continued access to the Mitchell family. Fortune. The sea bass on my plate was perfectly prepared, each bite a small reminder of the careful preparation that had gone into this evening. Like this meticulously cooked dish, every element of my plan had been precisely timed, methodically, arranged, waiting for the right moment. Gerald had always prided himself on his strategic thinking, but he'd forgotten that I'd learned from the best, his father, whose business acumen and foresight had built the very foundation Gerald had tried to claim as his own. The evening progressed, with the same polished veneer that had characterized our marriage for the past 5 years, but beneath the surface, currents of change were already in motion. Tomorrow, Gerald would discover just how completely he had miscalculated. The lifestyle he thought was secured by his birthright would crumble, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet efficiency of properly executed legal documents and financial transfers. The first warning signs had appeared as subtle as changing seasons. Like leaves turning color before autumn, Gerald's behavior had shifted in ways only someone intimately familiar with his patterns would notice. The way he positioned his laptop screen away from me when working from home, how his phone always lay face down, the sudden increase in early morning wellness routines that ran into lunch hours. Our Central Park West apartment, once a testament to our shared success, had become a stage where we both played our parts. Morning light, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminated the space where Gerald took his calls, now always in hushed tones on the balcony. The marble countertops reflected his untouched espresso cups, evidence of breakfasts missed due to increasingly early departures. It was during one of these quiet mornings that I first noticed the receipt from Tiffany's tucked carelessly in his suit jacket, a purchase that never made its way to my jewelry box. The amount matched a mysterious withdrawal from our joint account, one of many financial breadcrumbs he'd been leaving behind. Each discovery was like a piece of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving. Jane's words echoed in my mind as I observed. "These changes. Watch the money," she'd advised during one of our lunch meetings. "People lie, but bank statements tell stories they never intended to share." The irony wasn't lost on me. Gerald had always praised my financial acumen when it benefited his ventures, never imagining those same skills would illuminate his deception. The Mitchell family's Fifth Avenue offices had become a treasure trove of information. Each visit to bring Gerald lunch revealed new details. The way Zelda's wellness consultations always seemed to run overtime, how their heads would bend close, together over property plans, the lingering glances when they thought no one was watching. The same office where Gerald had once proudly displayed our wedding photo now held subtle hints of a future he was planning without me. Kevin's conscience had finally broken during the Metropolitan Museum Gala. Between auction bids and champagne toasts, he had pulled me aside into a quiet gallery and revealed how Gerald had been reallocating funds, using the Mitchell family's assets as leverage for properties intended for his new life with Zelda. The signs became clearer in our social circle. At dinner parties, Gerald's hand no longer rested casually on my lower back. During charity board meetings, his chair gradually moved further from mine. Even his sister Lynn's behavior changed, her usual warm embraces replaced by awkward pauses and averted eyes. She knew something, but loyalty to her brother kept her silent. Anthony Hayes proved invaluable during this time. Over lengthy meetings in his wood-paneled office on Madison Avenue, we traced the web of financial decisions Gerald had made. Each document revealed a new layer of his plan. Properties purchased under shell companies, investments redirected. Through obscure channels, all leading toward a future that didn't include me. The trust my father-in-law had insisted upon maintaining separate from our marital assets now seemed less like paternal control and more like prescient wisdom. The Mitchell Investment Group's quarterly meeting provided another piece of the puzzle. Gerald attended virtually, citing a site visit that couldn't be rescheduled. That same afternoon, a junior associate mentioned seeing him at the Mark Hotel, deep in conversation with a leasing agent known for handling exclusive properties. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture I had suspected but wanted to confirm. Our home security system logged his late-night arrivals, each one marked by the soft ping of notifications on my phone. The timestamps matched perfectly with the schedule of private sessions at the Brooklyn Heights property, sessions that appeared in no official documentation but were carefully noted by the security guard who owed his position to my recommendation. Even our favorite restaurants held clues. The maitre d' at Le Bernardin, who had known us since our engagement, mentioned seeing Gerald dining there on evenings when he was supposedly in Boston for meetings. The reservation had been under Mitchell Zen, not exactly subtle, but then Gerald had always underestimated how much people notice, how many quiet allies I had in places he took for granted. The changes in his wardrobe spoke volumes. New athletic wear I hadn't seen him purchase, a different cologne that lingered on his shirts when they returned from the dry cleaners. Small details that might have seemed insignificant in isolation, but together painted a picture of a man preparing for a new chapter, a chapter he thought he could write while still maintaining access to the life we'd built together. My own preparations were equally detailed but far more discreet. Each discovery was carefully documented, every transaction traced, every witness statement recorded. Jane's legal expertise ensured that every move we made was unassailable. While Gerald orchestrated his exit, I orchestrated something far more intricate. The systematic dismantling of the financial safety net he thought would always support him. The Manhattan rain provided a fitting backdrop to these revelations, each gray day matching the gradual unraveling of what I'd thought was a solid marriage. But unlike the weather, this wasn't a natural progression. It was a calculated deception that required an equally calculated response. As I watched him leave, For another early meditation session, I knew the time for passive observation was coming to an end. The security footage from the Brooklyn Heights property arrived in my email each evening, courtesy of the system Gerald himself had insisted on installing. Each file showed the same pattern: his car arriving just minutes after Zelda's, their shadows moving behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of what was supposed to be a model apartment. The timestamps matched perfectly with the times the leasing agent had logged for apartment viewings and contract discussions. In his rush to plan his new future, Gerald had forgotten the fundamental rule of New York's high society: relationships matter more than money. The network of connections I'd built over years of charity work and board meetings proved invaluable. Each person who came forward with information, each document shared over quiet coffee meetings, each whispered conversation at gallery openings, all of it contributed to my understanding of just how completely Gerald had underestimated me. The revelation came on a Tuesday afternoon, when Manhattan's typical gray skies had momentarily given way to unexpected sunshine. I sat in Jane's corner office at her law firm, 40 floors above the city streets, as she carefully laid out a series of documents across her desk. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated each page like a spotlight on an unwanted truth. "You need to see this, Abby," Jane said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who knew they were about to shatter a friend's world. The folder she pushed across her glass desk contained more than just papers. It held the evidence of Gerald's most elaborate deception yet: lease agreements, financial disclosures, and a detailed timeline for a move scheduled for exactly 1 month from today. The same week, Gerald had scheduled his supposed business trip to London. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd chosen apartments in the same building where we'd celebrated our engagement 5 years ago. The afternoon light cast long shadows across Jane's office as she pulled up additional documentation on her computer: property transfers, strategic investments, and careful movements of assets, all orchestrated by Gerald over the past 6 months. He'd been methodically preparing for a future that didn't include me, yet relied entirely on resources that belonged to his family's trust. "There's more," Jane said, turning her monitor toward me. Security footage from the Brooklyn Heights development showed Gerald and Zelda entering the penthouse suite together, not for property tours or wellness consultations, but for intimate dinners and long evenings that extended well past business hours. The timestamp on one video matched exactly with the night he told me he was stuck in emergency meetings with overseas investors. My mind wandered to the morning Gerald had first introduced Zelda as the wellness consultant for the Mitchell Group's executive team. She'd stood in our office with her portfolio of corporate mindfulness programs, all perfectly curated regimens and practiced professionalism. I remembered thinking how young she looked, how eager to prove herself in Manhattan's competitive wellness industry. Now I understood that her ambitions extended far beyond guided meditation. The sound of traffic below filled the silence as I continued reading through the documents. Each page revealed a new layer of deception: how Gerald had been gradually transferring assets, setting up new accounts, and creating a financial framework for his new life. He'd even begun the process of establishing a separate business entity, one that would operate independently from the Mitchell Group. "He's been careful," Jane noted, her legal training evident in how she'd organized the evidence, but he made one crucial mistake. She pointed to a series of transactions that all traced back to the Mitchell family trust. In his haste to build his new life, Gerald had forgotten that his access to these funds was contingent on our marriage. Even more importantly, he'd overlooked the fact that I retained sole control over the trust's major assets. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across Manhattan's skyline as Jane outlined the extent of Gerald's plans. He'd arranged everything meticulously, from the private move-in to the weekend getaway in Tulum. The guest list for their housewarming included several of our mutual business associates, people who regularly sat across from me in board meetings. The betrayal extended beyond just our marriage. It reached into every aspect of our professional lives. What Gerald didn't know was that Anthony Hayes had already flagged several suspicious transactions to the Mitchell Investment Group's board. The seemingly routine business expenses he'd been claiming were easily traced to apartment preparations, security deposits disguised as property development costs, furnishing purchases hidden within operational overhead. My phone buzzed with a message from Kevin, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. He'd forwarded an email chain detailing how Gerald had been reallocating resources from existing projects to fund his secret apartment preparations. The message included a note of apology. I should have said something sooner. He swore it was all above board. The city lights began to twinkle as dusk settled over Manhattan. Jane and I remained in her office, methodically working through each document, building a comprehensive understanding of just how extensive Gerald's deception had become. The apartment lease was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it lay a carefully constructed scheme to secure his financial future using his family's assets. What he's done, Jane explained, her legal expertise evident in her careful choice of words, isn't just a personal betrayal. There are serious financial implications. She pulled out another file, this one containing records of how Gerald had misrepresented his authority over certain assets when securing new business deals. The evening grew darker as we continued our review. Each document told part of a larger story, one of calculated deception and careful planning. Yet in all his meticulous preparation, Gerald had overlooked the most crucial detail. The very foundation of his plans rested on assets he didn't actually control. A slight smile crossed my face as I realized the full extent of his oversight. While he'd been planning his escape, I'd been quietly consolidating my control over the Mitchell family's business interests. Each meeting I'd attended, every charity function I'd hosted, every business lunch I'd organized, all had served to strengthen my position within Manhattan's business community. The city lights blurred below as tears finally filled my eyes. Not from sadness, but from the sheer audacity of it all. How had he thought he would get away with this? Did he really believe I wouldn't notice? Or had he simply underestimated me so completely that he thought I wouldn't understand the complexity of his financial maneuvers? Jane reached across her desk and squeezed my hand, her gesture offering support rather than sympathy. We both knew what needed to happen next. The evidence was clear, the documentation complete. Now it was time to act, to show Gerald exactly who he'd underestimated. Outside, Manhattan's nightlife was coming alive, the streets filling with people heading to dinner or evening events. Somewhere in this city, Gerald was probably with Zelda, perhaps finalizing details for their new life together, blissfully unaware that their carefully laid plans were about to unravel. The thought brought a calmness I hadn't expected, the kind of peace that comes with finally seeing the complete picture and knowing exactly what needs to be done. The planning phase required precision that would rival any surgical procedure. In my home office overlooking Central Park, I began meticulously arranging the pieces of my response. Each document was carefully organized, every detail accounted for as I prepared to dismantle the life Gerald thought he had secured. Anthony Hayes arrived early the next morning, his leather briefcase containing the final pieces we needed. The morning light filtered through the rain-streaked windows as we reviewed the trust documents, highlighting key clauses that Gerald had conveniently overlooked in his ambitious planning. The coffee grew cold in our cups as we traced ownership paths and control structures, mapping out the exact steps needed to protect the Mitchell family's interests. At my request, the Mitchell Investment Group had scheduled an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. The timing was deliberate. It would coincide perfectly with Gerald's wellness session with Zelda at the Brooklyn Heights property. The thought of him standing there discussing feng shui and energetic alignment while his professional world quietly imploded brought a certain satisfaction. Jane had been instrumental in preparing the legal framework. Her office had become a second command center, where we orchestrated each move with calculated precision. The documentation was impeccable. Every transfer, every signature, every decision backed by years of careful record-keeping that my father-in-law had insisted upon. The afternoon sun broke through Manhattan's persistent clouds as Kevin arrived, with the final audits of the Mitchell Group's development division. His face showed the strain of recent weeks, the conflict between loyalty to his business partner and his moral compass evident in the deep lines around his eyes. The files he brought revealed the full extent of Gerald's financial maneuvering, creative, accounting that would soon come under intense scrutiny. My laptop chimed with an email from the West Village Luxury Apartment Management. They had been surprisingly cooperative once presented with evidence of Gerald's financial misrepresentations. The lease agreement, signed under questionable pretenses, would be void by tomorrow morning. Let Zelda deal with finding a new location for their love nest. The security team at the Brooklyn Heights development had proven invaluable, providing detailed logs of every after-hours visit, every private meeting that had nothing to do with meditation or wellness. Their reports painted a clear picture of Gerald's extracurricular activities, each entry another nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed deception. Evening settled over the city as I finalized the last details with my private investigator. Her findings had been thorough. Every dinner reservation, every hotel check-in, every hidden purchase meticulously documented. The evidence she'd gathered would ensure that when the time came, there would be no room for denial or negotiation. The transformation of our shared office space had begun subtly. Each day, another photo disappeared from the walls, another personal item removed from my desk. The space was being systematically stripped of any trace of our partnership, both personal and professional. Gerald, too preoccupied with his secret plans, hadn't even noticed. My phone buzzed with updates from the accounting team. They had traced every dollar Gerald had diverted, every resource he'd misappropriated. The spreadsheets told a story of systematic deception, of a man so confident in his control that he'd left an obvious trail. Tomorrow, that same confidence would be his undoing. The catering company called to confirm the cancellation of their services for what was supposed to be Zelda's housewarming party. They'd been apologetic, professional, and most importantly, discreet. Another piece of Gerald and Zelda's perfect life quietly dismantled. The same scene was playing out across Manhattan, vendors, suppliers, and service providers all receiving similar notifications. Rain began to fall again as I reviewed the guest list for their planned housewarming celebration. Names jumped out at me: business associates, clients, even members of my own social circle. Each person on that list represented a connection that Gerald thought he owned, not realizing how many of them owed their loyalty to the Mitchell family name. The clock on my desk showed well past midnight as I finished preparing the documents for tomorrow's board meeting. Each page represented another aspect of Gerald's world that would soon be beyond his reach: the properties he'd leveraged, the contracts he'd signed, the deals he'd made. All of it built on a foundation he didn't actually control. My father-in-law's portrait watched over me as I worked, his stern expression a reminder of why he'd insisted on keeping the family trust separate from my marriage. He'd seen something in Gerald that I'd been too blinded by love to recognize, a hunger for power that overshadowed any genuine emotion. The final piece arrived via courier just before dawn, documentation from the bank confirming the freeze-on, specific accounts and assets. The timing was crucial. Everything had to happen in perfect sequence, like dominoes arranged with careful precision. Each action would trigger the next, creating a cascade that would leave nothing of Gerald's carefully constructed world standing. Manhattan awakened to rare, clear skies, the morning sun illuminating the city skyline in golden hues. In a few hours, Gerald would arrive at the Brooklyn Heights property, expecting to finalize details for his new beginning with Zelda. Instead, he would find himself facing an ending he hadn't anticipated. The thought brought neither joy nor sadness, only a calm certainty that justice was about to be served. The morning traffic built up outside as I made my final preparations. Each document was in its place, every detail attended to. Now it was simply a matter of waiting for the perfect moment to set everything in motion. Gerald had always prided himself on his strategic thinking, but he was about to learn that he wasn't the only one capable of planning ahead. I found myself reflecting on how we'd arrived at this point, tracing the arc of our relationship from its promising beginning to this calculated end. The Mitchell name had been synonymous with old New York money for generations. Their real estate empire, built by Gerald's grandfather during the post-war boom, had transformed into a diversified investment portfolio spanning luxury developments, hospitality ventures, and tech startups. Gerald had been the golden boy, Yale-educated, charming, and born with the confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. When we'd met at the Guggenheim benefit 5 years ago, I'd been working as corporate counsel for a major investment firm. My modest background from Connecticut had been worlds away from Gerald's Manhattan upbringing, but my Harvard law degree had granted me entry into the circles where families like the Mitchells operated. What attracted me initially wasn't his wealth, but his vision, or what I'd perceived as vision. His passionate plans for expanding the family business, his ideas for charitable initiatives, his apparent desire to make a meaningful impact rather than simply living off his inheritance. I'd believed we shared values, ambitions, a desire to build something lasting together. Charles Mitchell, Gerald's father, had seen through his son much earlier than I had. Our engagement announcement had been met with measured enthusiasm from Gerald's parents. While his mother organized lavish engagement parties, Charles had requested a private meeting with me at the family's Madison Avenue offices. "My son has many qualities," he'd said, looking out over the city his family had helped shape. "But financial discipline isn't among them." That afternoon, Charles had outlined his concerns about Gerald's spending habits, his impulsive decision-making, his tendency to start projects without finishing them. I'd defended Gerald, believing his father was simply being overly cautious, perhaps unable to see his son as the man he'd become, rather than the boy he'd raised. The prenuptial agreement had been non-negotiable, but Charles had insisted on something more, a trust structure that would protect the family's assets regardless of what happened between Gerald and me. At his insistence, I'd been named as a trustee alongside him, a position that gave me significant oversight of the family's holdings. "It's not that I don't trust my son," Charles had explained, "but I know him. Money that comes too easily tends to go just as easily." At the time, I'd seen it as unnecessary overreach, perhaps even an insult to Gerald. Now I recognized it as foresight, born from decades of watching his son's relationship with money and responsibility. Our wedding at the Plaza had been the social event of the season. 600 guests. Orchids flown in from Thailand, a 15-piece orchestra, and coverage in Vogue. Looking back, I realized it had all been a performance for Gerald, another acquisition, another achievement to display, rather than a commitment to build a life together. The early years of our marriage had been good, or at least I'd thought so. We'd traveled extensively, renovated the Central Park West apartment, hosted dinners for New York's elite. I'd continued my legal career, eventually moving in-house at the Mitchell Group at Charles's request. "We need someone with your mind watching." The details, he'd said, in what I now understood was another layer of protection he was placing around the family's wealth. Charles's unexpected death 2 years ago had been the turning point, though I hadn't recognized it then. The heart attack had come suddenly, leaving no time for goodbyes or final instructions. The reading of the will had been Gerald's first shock. His father had left operational control of the Mitchell Group to a board of trustees rather than directly to his son. Gerald had received generous distributions and a prominent title, but the actual control of assets remained with the trust, where I maintained a key position. Gerald's spending had accelerated after his father's death. The sports, car collection, the Hamptons renovation, the increasingly extravagant gifts to himself. I'd attributed it to grief at first, a way of coping with the loss of his father, and the perceived slight of not being given full control of the family business. The Mitchell matriarch Eleanor had watched with resigned disappointment, occasionally, making cryptic comments about how history repeats itself. It was during the renovation of the Mitchell Group's wellness center that Zelda had entered our lives. Young, beautiful, and certified in half a dozen Eastern practices, she'd been brought in as a consultant for the employee wellness program. Gerald had immediately championed her ideas, expanding her role from occasional instructor to full-time corporate wellness director, a position created specifically for her. I'd been too consumed with managing the legal implications of several major acquisitions to pay much attention to the new wellness initiative. The late nights at the office, the weekend conferences, the constant pressure of protecting the Mitchell legacy had created space between Gerald and me. Space that Zelda had eagerly filled with her youth, attention, and apparent admiration. The Mia. Signs had been there from the beginning. Gerald's sudden interest in meditation, his new vocabulary of mindfulness and spiritual alignment, the unexplained charges for weekend retreats I'd never heard about. Like many betrayals, it had unfolded gradually, each small deception paving the way for larger ones until a parallel life had formed alongside our marriage. What Gerald hadn't counted on was that the same attention to detail that made me an effective corporate counsel also made me an observant wife. The same skills that protected the Mitchell family's assets allowed me to trace the breadcrumbs of his betrayal back to their source. The same networks I'd built to advance the family's business. Interests became the channels through which information about his deception flowed back to me. Anthony Hayes had been particularly valuable during this time. As Charles's longtime financial advisor, he'd watched Gerald grow up and had harbored no illusions about his character. Charles knew exactly what he was doing when he set up the "trust the way he did," Anthony had told me during one of our late-night review sessions. He loved his son, but he wasn't blind to his weaknesses. The confrontation was set to unfold at L'Artusi, one of New York's most exclusive Italian restaurants where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the West Village. I had chosen this venue deliberately. It was where Gerald had first taken me after our engagement, where we'd celebrated countless business deals, and where tonight his carefully constructed world would begin to crumble. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the script had been meticulously crafted. All that remained was for the curtain to rise on Gerald's final act as the entitled heir to the Mitchell fortune, an act that would conclude very differently than he had planned. The confrontation unfolded at L'Artusi as planned. Gerald sat across from me, his confident smile never quite reaching his eyes as he studied the wine list. The soft lighting caught the silver at his temples, a distinguished touch that had once made my heart skip, but now seemed like another carefully cultivated element of his personal brand. Zelda arrived precisely on schedule, wearing a sleek black Valentino dress that probably cost more than her monthly yoga instructor salary. Her presence was part of my design, an orchestrated piece in this evening's performance. She hesitated at the entrance, spotting us at our usual table, confusion flickering across her perfectly made-up face. The sommelier approached with a bottle of Gerald's favorite Barolo, unaware of the tension building at our table. I watched, as Gerald's expression shifted from confusion to alarm when Zelda began walking toward us. He hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated that I would arrange for all three of us to be here together. "What a lovely surprise," I said, my voice carrying just enough warmth to appear genuine to nearby diners. "Please join us. We were just discussing the Brooklyn Heights development." The look that passed between them spoke volumes, a silent conversation of panic and uncertainty. The city lights twinkled beyond the glass as Zelda reluctantly took her seat. Gerald's complexion had paled slightly, his usual confidence wavering as he realized this wasn't a chance encounter. The waiter appeared with an extra wine glass, and I took control of the bottle, pouring generously for each of us. "To new beginnings," I offered, raising my glass. The irony of my toast wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Gerald took a large swallow of wine while Zelda barely touched hers. The fear in her eyes suggested she knew something was wrong but couldn't quite grasp what was happening. The executive chef, an old family friend, sent over an amuse-bouche, delicate spoonfuls of yellowfin tuna tartare. I watched as Gerald struggled to maintain his composure, his eyes darting between Zelda and me. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time, he wasn't in control. The leasing office at West Village Residences called today, I mentioned, casually, watching their reactions. Apparently there was some confusion about a lease application for next month. Gerald's fork clattered against his plate, the sound sharp in the elegant dining room. Zelda's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. The evening air grew thick with unspoken words as I pulled out a manila envelope from my designer bag. I thought we should discuss some paperwork, I continued, my voice steady. There seemed to be some discrepancies in the recent financial transactions. Manhattan's lights created a glittering backdrop as I laid out document after document. Bank statements, property applications, transfer records. Each piece of paper another nail in the coffin of Gerald's deception. His face grew increasingly ashen as he realized the extent of my knowledge. "How did you—" he started, but I cut him off with a gentle shake of my head. The other diners continued their meals, oblivious to the drama unfolding at our table. This was New York's upper echelon. Appearances had to be maintained even in moments of crisis. Zelda's mascara had begun to smudge slightly at the corners of her eyes. The confident yoga instructor who had planned to step into my life was crumbling under the weight of reality. She hadn't known about the Mitchell family trust, about the true ownership of the assets Gerald had promised her. The waiter appeared with our main courses, perfectly seared scallops that no one would touch. Gerald attempted to regain control, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We can discuss this privately," he insisted, but I merely smiled and took another sip of wine. "I think we're past privacy, don't you?" I replied, sliding another document across the table. "Especially given the guest list for your upcoming housewarming." The paper contained names of New York's business elite, people who would soon learn exactly how Gerald had attempted to manipulate his way into their social circle using the Mitchell family's resources. The sound of gentle jazz from the restaurant's piano player provided an elegant soundtrack to the unfolding scene. I watched as Gerald's hands began to shake slightly, his carefully maintained facade cracking under pressure. Zelda looked like she wanted to disappear into her expensive dress. "The Mitchell Investment Group board meets tomorrow morning," I continued, my voice carrying just enough edge to make both of them flinch. "They're particularly interested in reviewing some recent financial decisions." Gerald's face went completely white. He knew what that meant. Outside, a taxi horn sounded across the street, its impatient tone oddly appropriate for the moment. I reached into my bag once more, producing a final set of papers. "These require your immediate attention," I said, sliding them toward Gerald. "Unless you'd prefer to discuss everything in a more public forum." The evening had entered its final act. I watched as Gerald scanned the documents, his legal training allowing him to quickly grasp their implications. Everything he had built using his family's resources was about to be dismantled. His dream of a new life with Zelda, funded by Mitchell money, was evaporating before his eyes. A nearby table ordered champagne, their celebration creating a stark contrast to our quiet drama. Zelda's phone buzzed, probably the interior designer, unaware that there would be no new apartment to decorate next month. Gerald loosened his tie slightly, a rare display of discomfort in his usually polished appearance. I signaled for the check, my decision made long before this dinner began. The restaurant's soft lighting caught the diamond on my finger, the ring that had once symbolized our partnership now just another asset to be divided. Tomorrow, New York's business community would wake up to a very different reality. The turning point arrived with the precision of a perfectly executed business deal. Morning light streamed through the Mitchell Investment Group's boardroom windows as Gerald strode in, his confidence still intact, unaware that everything was about to change. The mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lighting, each leather chair occupied by a board member who had known Charles, who had watched the Mitchell empire grow, who had seen through Gerald's facade long before I had. Anthony Hayes sat at the far end, his silver hair catching the light as he organized the morning's documentation. The quarterly financial reports lay before each seat, but these weren't the routine statements Gerald was expecting. Inside each folder was a detailed accounting of every misappropriated dollar, every fraudulent transaction, every asset he had leveraged without proper authorization. The New York skyline provided a dramatic backdrop as Gerald took his usual seat, straightening his custom-made suit jacket. He nodded to several board members, his practiced charm on full display. Kevin arrived moments later, choosing a seat far from his business partner, the weight of what was to come evident in his careful avoidance of eye contact. "Before we begin," I announced, standing at the head of the table where Charles had once presided, "there are some urgent matters requiring our immediate attention." The subtle shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable. Board members straightened, in their chairs, their expressions grave as they opened their folders. Gerald reached for his own folder, his manicured fingers trembling slightly as he lifted the cover. I watched his face as he scanned the first page, saw the exact moment he realized what was happening. The color drained from his face, his practiced smile faltering for the first time since he'd entered the room. "As you can see," I continued, my voice steady and clear, "we've uncovered several concerning discrepancies in recent financial transactions." The projector hummed to life, displaying a detailed flowchart of funds moving through various accounts, all leading back to properties and investments Gerald had intended for his new life with Zelda. The morning sun cast long shadows across the boardroom as Gerald attempted to interrupt, but Anthony Hayes cleared his throat, a sound that carried decades of authority. "I suggest you review the documentation thoroughly before making any statements, Mr. Mitchell," he said. The use of Gerald's surname rather than the familiar Gerald marked the shift in his status. A light rain began to fall outside, New York's trademark weather providing a fitting backdrop to the unfolding scene. Board members murmured among themselves as they reviewed the evidence, their expressions growing increasingly stern. These were people who had built their reputations on integrity, who valued the Mitchell name and all it represented. Gerald's phone buzzed, probably Zelda wondering why he wasn't at their scheduled yoga session at the Brooklyn Heights property. He silenced it without looking, his attention fixed on the damning evidence before him. Each page revealed another layer of his deception, another carefully planned move that was now backfiring spectacularly. The presentation continued methodically, outlining every instance where Gerald had overstepped his authority, property acquisitions made without proper approval, funds diverted through questionable channels, contracts signed under misrepresented pretenses, all of it documented with irrefutable clarity. Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his seat as his own role came under scrutiny. While not directly complicit in Gerald's schemes, he had turned a blind eye to many questionable decisions. His future at the Mitchell Group now hung in the balance, dependent on his cooperation in the coming investigations. A senior board member who had worked alongside Charles for 30 years removed his glasses and fixed Gerald with a penetrating stare. "Would you care to explain these discrepancies, Mr. Mitchell?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implied consequences. Gerald loosened his tie slightly, his composure cracking under the collective scrutiny. Security personnel appeared discreetly at the boardroom doors, a necessary precaution given the magnitude of what was transpiring. I had seen enough corporate takedowns to know that desperation could lead to unpredictable behavior. Gerald noticed them too, his eyes darting between the exits as reality began to sink in. The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the New York skyline beyond the windows. Somewhere out there at the Brooklyn Heights property, Zelda was probably wondering why neither Gerald nor the interior designer had arrived for their appointment. The thought brought no satisfaction, only a sense of justice being served. Anthony Hayes began distributing another set of documents, legal papers that would sever Gerald's connection to the Mitchell family's assets. The soft sound of papers being passed along the table was the only noise in the room. Each board member signed without hesitation, their pens scratching against paper like final nails in a coffin. Gerald's hands shook visibly as he reached for his water glass. The man who had swept into my life with such confidence, who had built his reputation on charm and calculated risks, was watching his carefully constructed world dissolve. The access he'd taken for granted, the business connections he'd cultivated, the future he'd planned, all of it built on a foundation he didn't actually control. A gentle knock at the door signaled the arrival of the legal team from Jane's firm. They entered quietly, their presence marking the transition from corporate meeting to legal proceeding. Each carried briefcases containing additional documentation, cease and desist orders, property liens, asset freezes, all prepared in advance and ready to be executed. The rain intensified outside, drops streaking down the windows like tears. New York was crying for a dynasty that never was. Gerald finally found his voice, attempting to mount a defense, but his words rang hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence. The board members listened with stony expressions, years of business experience allowing them to see through his desperate explanations. Kevin excused himself quietly, unable to watch his former partner's downfall. His own future would need to be addressed. But for now, he was just another witness to the dismantling of Gerald Mitchell's ambitions. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Gerald increasingly isolated at the table. The morning had turned into a professional execution. Each document signed, each decision recorded, each asset reclaimed by its rightful owners. The Mitchell family name would endure, its reputation perhaps even strengthened by this display of decisive action in the face of betrayal. The emotional aftermath settled over me like New York's familiar morning fog as I sat in Charles's old study, now mine, within the Mitchell family's Upper East Side brownstone. The leather chair still held his imprint, a reminder of the countless hours he'd spent teaching me about business, about trust, about reading people. The morning light filtered through rain-streaked windows, casting gentle shadows across the antique desk where I now processed everything that had transpired. My fingers traced the edge of a photograph taken at last year's Met Gala. Gerald and I standing together, his arm around my waist, both of us smiling for the camera. It seemed impossible that just 12 months ago I had still believed in the life we'd built. The frame made a soft thud as I placed it face down on the desk. The soft chime of my phone drew my attention to a message from Jane. Another client had withdrawn from the Mitchell Group's wellness initiative, citing concerns about recent revelations. The domino effect was in full swing, each falling piece, exactly as we'd predicted. Gerald's reputation in New York's business community was crumbling faster than autumn leaves in Central Park. The rain tapped against the window panes as I reviewed the morning's financial reports. The Mitchell Investment Group stock had actually risen since the news broke, the market responding favorably to our swift and decisive action. Charles would have been proud of how we'd handled the crisis, protecting not just the assets but the reputation he'd spent a lifetime building. A gentle knock at the door preceded Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper of 20 years, bringing in a fresh pot of tea. Her eyes held a mixture of concern and relief as she set the silver service down. "Ms. Lynn called again," she said softly. "She's worried about you being here alone." I smiled, appreciating Gerald's sister's concern, but knowing I needed this solitude to process everything. The tea's steam rose in delicate spirals as I poured a cup, its familiar Earl Grey scent grounding me in the present moment. Lynn didn't understand that I wasn't hiding. I was centering myself, finding strength in the very rooms where I'd learned about power, responsibility, and the true meaning of legacy from Charles Mitchell himself. Anthony Hayes's latest email detailed the continuing fallout. 3 more development projects had been frozen pending full financial audits. The client list Gerald had so carefully cultivated was dissolving, each investor eager to distance themselves from the scandal. His carefully constructed house of cards was falling, each revelation bringing new consequences. My attention turned to a stack of RSVPs on the desk, responses to next month's annual Mitchell Foundation Gala. Several of New York's most prominent families had already confirmed their attendance, a clear signal that they were aligning themselves with the Mitchell name rather than Gerald's tarnished reputation. Social warfare in New York was always subtle but decisive. The sound of rain intensified as I opened my laptop, reviewing the latest press coverage. Local business journals had picked up the story, their headlines carefully worded but unmistakable in their implications. Gerald's fall from grace was becoming public knowledge, his reputation unraveling thread by thread in the media he'd once courted so successfully. A text message lit up my phone. Zelda, surprisingly. Her name on the screen caused a complex wave of emotions. Rather than anger, I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. She, too, had been deceived, led to believe in promises built on borrowed power and stolen dreams. Her message was simple. I didn't. No. I'm sorry. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed noon as I considered my response. In the end, I chose silence. Some betrayals ran too deep for words. Some apologies came too late to matter. Let her live with the consequences of her choices, just as I was living with mine. Thunder rolled in the distance as I reviewed the latest reports from the property management company. The Brooklyn Heights development, where Gerald and Zelda had spent so many wellness sessions, was being rebranded, all traces of Gerald's involvement systematically erased. The project was returning fully under Mitchell Group control, with a new wellness center concept that emphasized authentic community programs rather than executive perks. A fresh stack of documents arrived via courier, transfer papers requiring my signature. Each page represented another piece of Gerald's world being reclaimed, another asset returning to its rightful ownership. My signature flowed smoothly across each line, years of practice making the motion automatic, definitive. The kind. Rain eased as afternoon light softened the study's shadows. A photo album lay open on the side table. Pages filled with memories from charity events, business launches, social gatherings. Each image now held new meaning, each smile concealing truths I hadn't been ready to see. These weren't just photographs anymore. They were evidence of a masterful performance that had finally reached its end. Jane's afternoon update brought news of more client departures from Gerald's pet projects. The exodus was gaining momentum, each withdrawal adding pressure to his increasingly precarious position. His once impressive client portfolio was evaporating, leaving behind only questions and damaged trust. Mrs. Reynolds returned with fresh tea and a concerned expression. "There are reporters at the gate again," she reported quietly. The media attention had been building steadily, each new revelation feeding their hunger for details. But the Mitchell family had always understood the value of silence, of letting actions speak louder than words. The study's warmth contrasted sharply with the chill I felt reading Kevin's latest email. He was cooperating fully with the auditors, providing details of Gerald's financial maneuvers that even I hadn't known about. His testimony would be crucial in the coming weeks, as the full extent of the deception came to light. Evening approached, painting the sky in muted shades of gray and purple. From my window, I could see lights beginning to twinkle across the park, each one a reminder of the life I was reclaiming. The betrayal still stung, but it no longer held the power to break me. Instead, it had revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed. Darkness settled over the brownstone as I finally closed my laptop. The day's developments had unfolded exactly as planned, each move bringing us closer to a complete resolution. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, New opportunities to demonstrate exactly who controlled the empire Gerald had tried to claim as his own. The weeks that followed unfolded with the precision of a well-orchestrated symphony. The Mitchell Investment Group's public statement had been brief but devastating, acknowledging the discovery of financial irregularities that necessitated Gerald's removal from all positions of authority. The carefully worded press release made no mention of Zelda or the personal betrayal, focusing instead on the fiduciary responsibilities of the board and their commitment to protecting the Mitchell legacy. Gerald had retreated to his sister Lynn's Southampton home, his access to properties, accounts, and assets systematically revoked. His once busy social calendar had emptied overnight, invitations rescinded, club memberships placed under review, his carefully cultivated status evaporating, like morning mist. Zelda had disappeared from New York entirely, her Instagram account scrubbed of all Mitchell connections. Rumor had it she'd returned to California, her dreams of becoming a Manhattan wellness mogul as thoroughly dismantled as her relationship with Gerald. The Brooklyn Heights property had been completely redesigned. The penthouse suite Gerald had, intended for his love nest, transformed into a community space for wellness programs serving local residents. The irony wasn't lost on anyone familiar with the situation. The Mitchell Foundation's annual gala proceeded as planned, though with one notable absence from the family receiving line. I stood alongside Lynn and Eleanor Mitchell, the three of us, presenting a united front of Mitchell women. The event raised record funds for educational initiatives, the scandal seemingly having increased rather than diminished the family's social standing. Charles would be proud, Eleanor had whispered to me that evening, her first direct acknowledgement of everything that had transpired. He always said you had more Mitchell in you than Gerald ever did. The final legal documents arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after the boardroom confrontation. The trust restructuring was complete, the additional safeguards in place, the Mitchell family's assets more securely protected than ever before. Gerald's future distributions would be minimal and controlled, his days of leveraging family resources forever ended. As I signed the last paper, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a quiet certainty that I had fulfilled my responsibility to the legacy Charles Mitchell had entrusted to me. The pen made a soft scratch against the thick paper, a sound that seemed to echo with finality. New York continued its relentless pace outside my window, the city neither knowing nor caring about the private dramas that unfolded within its towering buildings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to build rather than merely preserve. The Mitchell legacy would continue, stronger for having weathered this storm, more secure in the hands of those who truly understood its value. The climactic board meeting at Mitchell Investment Group headquarters pulsed with an energy that even the floor-to-ceiling windows couldn't contain. New York's morning fog had lifted, revealing a crystal-clear view of the city Gerald had tried to conquer. Every seat around the mahogany table was filled. Board members, legal representatives, and key stakeholders all gathered for what would become a defining moment in the Mitchell family history. Gerald arrived precisely on schedule. His Armani suit and carefully styled hair a stark contrast to his ashen complexion. He'd aged years in the past week, the strain of watching his carefully constructed world crumble evident in every line of his face. The security guards positioned at each exit tracked his movement with practiced discretion. Anthony Hayes stood at the podium, his voice carrying decades of authority as he began presenting the final audit findings. The projector hummed to life, displaying spreadsheet after spreadsheet of fraudulent transactions, unauthorized transfers, and misappropriated funds. Each slide revealed another layer of deception, another carefully hidden manipulation of Mitchell family assets. Kevin sat opposite Gerald, his former partner now a key witness to the systematic dismantling of their shared empire. His testimony had been devastating, detailed accounts of how Gerald had leveraged Mitchell resources, manipulated contracts, and diverted funds for his personal ventures. The evidence was irrefutable, each document bearing Gerald's own signature. The morning light intensified as Jane's legal team distributed the final resolution papers. The rustle of pages turning filled the room as board members reviewed the terms. Complete severance of all ties between Gerald Mitchell and Mitchell Investment Group, immediate transfer of all properties and assets back to their rightful ownership, and full disclosure of all financial dealings during his tenure. Gerald's phone buzzed insistently, probably Zelda, or perhaps his lawyer trying to reach him before the final decisions were made. He ignored it, his eyes fixed on the documentation before him. The prenuptial agreement he'd once thought so clever now revealed itself as another miscalculation, its clauses working against him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The board members' expressions remained impassive as they reviewed the evidence, years of business experience allowing them to fully grasp the magnitude of Gerald's deception. These were people who had known Charles, who understood the weight of the Mitchell legacy. Their judgment would be swift and absolute. A senior partner from Jane's firm approached the podium, outlining the legal ramifications of Gerald's actions. Words like fraud, misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary duty echoed through the room. Each charge was backed by meticulous documentation, leaving no room for denial or negotiation. The New York skyline provided a dramatic backdrop as Gerald finally rose to speak. His voice, once so confident in these meetings, now wavering as he attempted to explain his actions. But the evidence spoke louder than any justification he could offer. Years of manipulation and deceit laid bare before the very people he'd tried to impress. Mrs. Reynolds had delivered fresh coffee and water, moving silently through the room like a ghost. Her presence reminded me of countless other meetings, other turning points in the Mitchell family history. She'd witnessed it all, her quiet dignity a constant through generations of business dealings. The morning wore on as resolution after resolution was presented and approved, each vote another nail in the coffin of Gerald's ambitions. The Mitchell Investment Group's future was being secured, its assets protected, its reputation preserved through decisive action and unwavering resolve. Anthony Hayes called for the final vote, the formal removal of Gerald Mitchell from all positions within the organization. Hands raised in unanimous agreement, a forest of conviction rising against the man who had dared to threaten the Mitchell legacy. The decision was recorded with meticulous care, becoming part of the official record. Security moved closer as Gerald's composure finally cracked. His hands trembled as he gathered his papers, his wedding ring catching the light one last time before disappearing into his pocket. The man who had swept into my life with such confidence was leaving as a shadow of himself, stripped of power and pretense. The city continued its busy pace beyond the windows, unaware of the drama unfolding in this boardroom. Somewhere out there, Zelda was probably still clinging to hopes of salvaging something from the wreckage, but there would be no rescue, no last-minute reprieve, no way to rebuild what had been so thoroughly destroyed. Jane's team began collecting signed documents, each page another piece of evidence in the complete dismantling of Gerald Mitchell's attempted takeover. The legal machinery would continue moving, ensuring that every aspect of his deception was exposed and addressed. The board members gathered their belongings, their duty discharged with the precision and gravity it deserved. They had protected the Mitchell name, upheld the principles Charles had established, and sent a clear message to New York's business community about the consequences of betrayal. As the room slowly emptied, I remained seated at the head of the table, feeling the weight of Charles's legacy. The morning sun cast my shadow across the polished wood, a silhouette of strength and determination. Gerald paused at the door, perhaps wanting to say something, but no words could bridge the chasm his actions had created. He left silently, the doctor closing behind him with a soft click that somehow carried more finality than a slam ever could. The final papers were filed, the last signatures recorded, the decisions set in motion. New York's business landscape had shifted, realigning itself around the undeniable truth that the Mitchell family's power remained undiminished, its authority absolute in the face of attempted usurpation. Manhattan's financial district buzzed, with the aftermath as I watched from the Mitchell Towers executive suite. Rain streaked down the windows, distorting the city lights into watercolor smudges. The media had caught wind of the story. Gerald Mitchell's spectacular fall from grace now occupied prime spots in business journals and social columns alike. My office had become a sanctuary of sorts, its walls absorbing the shockwaves rippling through New York's business community. Jane arrived with fresh coffee and the morning's headlines. The Wall Street Journal business section featured a particularly unflattering photo of Gerald leaving the Mitchell Investment Group building, his face a mask of defeat beneath his designer umbrella. The Mitchell family name remained untarnished, our swift and decisive action earning quiet approval from the city's elite. Invitations to upcoming social events continued to arrive, each one a subtle confirmation that society had chosen its side. The annual charity gala would proceed as planned, though with one notable absence from the guest list. A text message from Kevin illuminated my phone screen. The wellness initiative was being restructured, its programs redistributed among more reputable partners. The Brooklyn Heights property, once intended as a love nest for Gerald and Zelda, would now be completed under direct Mitchell Group supervision, its luxury apartments a testament to proper management and legitimate funding. The afternoon light softened as Anthony Hayes presented the latest financial reports. Our stock had not only stabilized, but strengthened, the market responding favorably to our handling of the crisis. Each decision, each careful move had served to reinforce the Mitchell family's position in New York's business hierarchy. The evening sun bathed Central Park in golden hues as I stood at the window of what was now entirely my apartment. The space, that had once felt like a stage set for our marriage, had been transformed. Gerald's possessions removed, the decor simplified, the energy completely different. Like the Mitchell Group itself, this home had been reclaimed and renewed. Zelda's resignation letter had arrived by courier earlier that day, formal, professionally worded, but carrying an undercurrent of desperation. Her wellness career in New York was effectively over. The social circles she'd hoped to enter had closed ranks, protecting their own against what they saw as an attempted infiltration. Mrs. Reynolds brought in tea as I reviewed the latest property transfers. The Hamptons estate, which Gerald had once hoped to claim as his weekend retreat with Zelda, remained securely in Mitchell family hands. Its gardens would bloom next spring without him. Its rooms would hold new memories, its future untainted by his presence. The setting sun painted the Manhattan skyline in shades of pink and gold as Jane's team finalized the last legal documents. Each page represented another door closing, another connection severed, another piece of Gerald's world being systematically dismantled. His attempts to contact me had ceased, reality finally sinking in. Evening news programs ran segments analyzing the business implications of Gerald's downfall. Financial experts dissected his mistakes, pointing out the hubris that had led him to believe he could outmaneuver the Mitchell family's generations of careful planning and strategic foresight. Eleanor called from her Upper East Side apartment, her concern evident even across the distance. She had warned me about her son's character flaws, had seen through his charm to the ambition beneath. Now she offered quiet support, understanding that some lessons must be learned firsthand, some battles fought alone. The city lights began to twinkle as I sorted through old photographs, separating memories from evidence. Each image told a story of calculated deception, charity galas, business, launches, social events where Gerald had played his part while plotting his escape. These would be archived, not destroyed, a reminder of lessons learned. Security reports detailed Gerald's movements, his departure from his club memberships, the cancellation of his social engagements, the quiet withdrawal from New York's elite circles. His world had contracted rapidly, the influence he'd thought was his revealed as merely borrowed power. Late night brought a final email from Anthony Hayes. The Mitchell Investment Group's board had approved a complete restructuring of our security protocols. Future attempts to manipulate our assets would face even stronger safeguards, our legacy protected by layers of carefully crafted oversight. My office overlooked the same skyline Gerald had once coveted, its gleaming towers and busy streets continuing their eternal dance. New York's business community had witnessed a master class in consequence, a reminder that true power lies not in appearances but in foundations built on integrity and careful stewardship. A gentle knock announced Mrs. Reynolds' eye. Evening round, she collected the tea service with practiced grace, her presence a reminder of the constants that had sustained the Mitchell family through generations of challenges. Some loyalties run deeper than ambition, some truth stands stronger than deception. The sigh. Night deepened as I reviewed plans for the Mitchell Foundation's upcoming initiatives. Life would continue, projects would progress, our influence would grow. Not through manipulation, but through the steady application of principles Charles had instilled. Gerald's attempt to hijack our legacy had only served to strengthen it. Rain returned, washing the city in sheets of silver. Somewhere out there, Gerald faced his first night of true reckoning. His dreams of power and position dissolved like morning mist. The future he'd planned was now nothing more than a cautionary tale in New York's social history. The final threads of autumn sunlight streamed through my office window at Mitchell Tower as I signed the last document finalizing Gerald's complete removal from New York's business landscape. The city sprawled below, unchanged yet fundamentally different from when this all began. The morning headlines had long since moved on to other stories, but the ripples of what happened still moved through the circles of power. The Mitchell Investment Group had emerged stronger, its reputation enhanced by the swift and decisive handling of Gerald's attempted coup. New partnerships formed, stronger alliances built on the foundation of proven integrity. The Brooklyn Heights development, now under complete Mitchell control, had become one of the most sought-after properties in the city. Its wellness center, redesigned with authentic community programs, had received praise from health publications and social critics alike, a testament to substance over style. Jane delivered the final report from her legal team, a comprehensive document detailing every aspect of Gerald's scheme and its systematic dismantling. The evidence would be archived, a testament to the importance of vigilance and the true nature of power. Some lessons need to be preserved for future generations. Kevin had rebuilt his reputation, his cooperation during the crisis earning him a path to redemption. Mitchell Wellness was now simply Elevate Wellness, its programs carefully vetted, its operations transparent. He had learned the value of choosing the right allies, of building success on solid ground rather than shifting. Zelda's designer yoga wear line never materialized. Her Instagram now featured generic sunset photos from a small studio in San Diego, her dreams of social ascension evaporating like morning fog. She had left New York quietly, her ambitious plans for becoming Manhattan's wellness guru to the elite, dissolved by her association with Gerald's downfall. The autumn rain returned, drawing patterns on my window as I reviewed the latest financial projections. The Mitchell family's influence had grown, our position in New York's business community strengthened by the very challenge that was meant to undermine it. Sometimes power reveals itself most clearly when tested. Mrs. Reynolds brought afternoon tea, her quiet presence a reminder of the constants that anchored our world. The silver service reflected the office lights, its polished surface showing nothing of the storms it had weathered. Some things remain, untarnished, their value lying in their steadfast nature rather than their shine. The city lights began their evening dance as I closed my laptop, another day of careful stewardship coming to an end. Gerald's last attempt to contact me had been returned unopened, his words unnecessary in the face of actions that had spoken so clearly. Some chapters need no epilogue, their endings written in the consequences they create. New York's social calendar continued its eternal round, though with subtle adjustments. The annual Mitchell Foundation Gala would proceed with its usual elegance, its guest list reflecting the new reality of power and influence. Some absences speak louder than any presence could. Night fell over the city as I gathered my things, ready to return to the Upper East Side brownstone. The gardens there would need attention soon, preparation for winter, an annual ritual that connected present to past. Some roots run too deep to be shaken by temporary storms. The security team's final report detailed Gerald's departure from New York, a quiet exit from the city he had tried to conquer. His ambitions had dissolved like mist, leaving behind only the bitter taste of lessons learned too late. Some defeats carry the seeds of greater victories within them. Charles's portrait watched over the office, his expression seeming to hold new wisdom in the evening light. He had understood the true nature of power, had built our legacy on foundations stronger than any individual's ambition. Some inheritances prove their worth most clearly in times of crisis. The city continued its busy pace below, unaware of the eye. Quiet triumph taking place in the towers above. The Mitchell name remained untarnished, its power undiminished, its future secure in hands that understood the responsibility of stewardship. Some victories need no fanfare to resonate through generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.